And we are live. So, John, thank you for
Hi,
joining Sentinel Apologetics. How are you doing?
thank you for having me. Very good.
So, just so everyone knows, we've. So, I emailed John about 3 months ago through Joshua Smobodos, who happens to be a friend. Uh, and then no response to you for like those 3 months. A lot of things were happening in my life. And then um, decided to finish your book last week. And uh, I was like, okay, I need to allocate a time to talk to you about it. So about what 2 hours ago, I emailed you
Wow.
again, and here we are. John was
Brilliant.
like, hey, let's talk tonight. Let's do it. So this is like impromptu. We're literally just getting to know each other, like literally live right now as well. So so John, let me just affirm to you that everything you've written in both of your books, but I think your second book, um, The Generations of Heaven and Earth, is something that I've been, I suppose, in my own, because I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm an amateur when it comes to this stuff. But I'm in academia when it comes to the sciences. It's just
Right.
once you're in academia, you know how to like the lay of the land works. So when it comes to biblical scholarship and like amalgamating that with um, those who are in the scientific fields, like say Josh, uh, it's just amazing how then if you are having a laser focused interest in the niche areas of the biblical context, like in this case to do with creation, I was starting to conjecture, but I just didn't have any like I don't know like anyone to sort of bounce the ideas with. But I was just personally conjecturing with, all right, Adam and Eve, Persian Gulf. They may
Hmm.
not be the first humans. Genesis 1 could be sort of like Genesis 1 ends in Genesis 2, verse 4 and 5, where from verse 5 onwards, it's a sequel going into the sequel, which is Adam and Eve, that comes out of that human race. Then when you talk about the creation not being fallen in the way we think of it from the 1500s onwards, and like all of that, which is just the tip of the iceberg on what you've written, I was thinking about from 2015 onwards. I was an atheist up until 2015. My journey started in 2010. Um, my favorite, uh, I suppose you could say, like a theodicy or a cosmogony uh, perspective comes from Leibniz, actually. Um, his notion of the best of all possible worlds and
Oh, yeah.
the creation has to start by default tohu vabohu. It's not that it becomes that in Genesis 3. It is that because that's what's natural to a created thing. It's very good, not perfect. Perfection is to do with the omni characteristics of God versus the non-omni characteristics of the creation, which means, so this is now the concluding my testimony here. The realization I had was if God is going to bring about a solution to tohu vabohu, as it starts with the chaotic waters in Genesis 1 2, Revelation
Yeah.
21 verse 1 ends with there's this new heaven and new earth, merism for universe, and there's no more sea, there's no more how it started, but those two tail ends are bridged in the middle with the incarnation, John 1:14,
Yeah.
that if you
Yeah.
have the
Absolutely.
logos in hypostasis with the cosmos, because through evolution Jesus' body is the cosmos, now you have that Colossians 1 verse 20 moment, or like Romans 8, where
Yeah.
Paul says everything is. So, like, again, these are just my sort of like musings. Already, I have a foot in the sciences. I know where that's going. I'm seeing the development of cutting edge scholarship. So, Mike Heiser was a close mentor of mine until he passed. Walton, Hugh Ross,
Yeah.
and I can just rattle off names that you're familiar with, and then your book is like a shadow copy of my thoughts. For example, you're good friends with Cy Gard. I'm
Yeah.
I
Oh,
I
yeah.
I
Fine.
I I I regularly talk to him. I've even had him on Sentinel, and I'm thinking, how have I not heard of you and your works until like not even say 6 months ago?
Well,
And
one
so
reason for that
that's
might have been that the second book came out
yeah,
just the month COVID started. So that was
right.
the end of any sort of interaction with the world on that, really.
So
But
in a nutshell, that's my introduction, like
that's good.
to you of where where I've been going with this. So yeah, feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, I've been a Christian forever. Well, since 1965, and I retired early in 2008, and for some reason found myself interested in trying to sort out that link between faith and theology. Faith and science. Had a career in medicine, but that started off from an interest in zoology and particularly paleontology. That was my childhood, interest. So it seemed a nice idea to try and see, can we bridge those gaps in a more successful way than has been done. And I found myself in discussion groups, particularly at Biologos, the theistic evolution lot, and was developing a lot of ideas. The first book came from a conversation I had with a church historian who threw me this wild card of a quote from Augustine, which suggested that the cosmos itself wasn't fallen, only man. And then we started swapping these patristic and old theological texts, which suggested that had been a very common view. Most of them came from him, but I read some from the. There's the book. I
Yeah,
read
I'll
some from
advertise
the.
the titles of your books as you talk
Thanks
about
very
them.
much.
Yeah.
From all good bookshops, but began to be unhappy with the theistic evolution paradigm. The book came about because I discussed it at Biologos, and Ted Davis, who's a science historian, said, "Oh, you should write a book about it." And I sort of said, "Oh yes, a retired GP overturning 500 years of theology." But it came about in the end. It took a long time, particularly acknowledge the help of
Just
Richard
to clarify,
Middleton.
I wouldn't say unturning, more like let's just go 1500 years back to the first century, because that's actually what's important, not what, you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was 1/3 of the book, looking at through all the old sources, looking at the Bible material more closely, and either seeing things I hadn't seen before or things I'd not fully taken into account. That was the second, or that was the 1/3 of the book, and the last third of the book was just looking at broadly scientific things. The evolutionary story is very much about red in tooth and claw, which again I don't think the natural world shows that. It's imprinted on it by a theory, if you like, just as the theological theory that the world fell with Adam, the natural world fell with Adam, is impinged upon it. So that book came out in 2019. And meanwhile, while it was a long gestation, Joshua Swamidas had come on the scene by Logos. And at one stage, and we got fairly close because he had a more critical attitude to theistic evolution than was normal on that site. And he did a piece on this thing that he came to call eventually the genealogical Adam and Eve. And I said, "Oh yeah, I've been interested in that since 2010," which I think shocked him a bit because he thought he'd thought of it. But in fact, it was the idea of a guy called David Opdebeck, who wasn't a biologist or a theologian, he was a lawyer. And he'd read a book that I'd actually read about the genetics of genealogy, which his aim was to dispense with racism by showing that everyone has mixed with each other over perhaps the last 2,000 years. Our last common ancestor as a human race is probably about 2,000 years ago or less. But David Optebeck picked up that idea and ran with it and said, well, this would apply to Adam and Eve. And if you are willing to accept that there were some kind of human beings, however you define them, before Adam and Eve in the garden, you could happily place Adam and Eve where the Bible seems to place them. That is in the the Chalcolithic or the Upper Neolithic or the early Bronze Age. That is, I always like to play with Ussher's dates and say 4004 BC. And Joshua and I started discussing that idea. I'd already on my blog done a few blogs on the implications of that. But as Joshua was preparing his book, which was dealing with the science of the thing, on which I sort of, with a lot of others, collaborated, he suggested I do another book on that theme. And what came out was the thought of trying to tie in a genuinely historical Adam and Eve into world history, as we found through science, with an old Earth, with ancient history and ancient prehistory, and to tie that in with the biblical theology, which is another interest of mine, the idea of the whole overarching story of the Bible, and that kind of came together as an attempt to use the genealogical Adam and Eve paradigm in order to bring a salvation history that made sense of the whole world, if you like, and where this last few thousand years between Adam and the return of Christ, how that fits into world history. And it's really sandwiched between a very long prehistory, the usual 14 billion years or whatever it is, and 4.5 billion years on Earth. That seems a long time. But there's an eternal spiritual creation following, which is and the salvation history part is just a blink of an eye, really, in that context. So that was one of the themes of the book.
Yep, absolutely incredible. Again, that particular lawyer that you're talking about, I personally never came across. But again, for me, what did it for me was actually Jeff Rose.
Yeah.
Working in the Persian Gulf period, I've brought him on actually twice onto Sentinel. He's actually just published a book last May, not this gone May, last year May, the prehistory of Arabia. Basically, say last 10 years of his work since 2010. For Springer publication, and there is a certain bias with respect to, I suppose, the Quran in that sense, because he being Jewish, but also having a lot of Muslim friends, and actually being that there is some sort of how do you put it, like some sort of, like, say, donations from Muslim groups in that area,
right,
to sort of help him, like, go for it, like there's enough details here from this culture, from the work that you're doing here and all that, we can actually fund you for this. And so his motivation then is to actually go all the way to the Quran. And because the Quran mentions this very peculiar group called the Ad, and that's to do with the like just south of the Persian Gulf area, that have traditions about Noah's flood, but in a very unique way, where they speak about more so like a cyclone, that like a category cyclone that may have not only did he showcase the physics in regards you can actually have a cyclone coming onto land, right? But the Indian Ocean spilling in, there could have been like a natural bridge that broke away, spilling in. And then he's fascinated to see that Genesis 8 mentions a wind that is moving the waters, but in this case that the waters are retreating. And in the ancient Near East, you have what's called the Anzu demon bird, which in the ancient Near East, that Anzu demon bird is specific for the flood. That is again like a windstorm. Like
Yeah.
they made a deity out of it. So Jeff Rose is like amalgamating all these themes, and then placing the flood to be anywhere between 12 and 8,000 years, somewhere around there. So yeah, but yeah, coming back to your work though, like um, for example, you talk about in chapter 10, religion before Adam, primitive religions of the world.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That was,
before that, yeah, no, go for it. Yeah.
well, one of the questions that would came up,
Hmm.
apart from the rather bizarre thing that the genealogical Adam was racist, as an idea, which
Okay.
Joshua had to
Yeah.
struggle with a lot more than I did. But um, what what you have with a recent Adam, you've got to deal with ancient man. And the more we know about ancient man, the more sophisticated he is, right back to the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and so on.
Hmm.
So trying to work out what kind of people were they, what was different about Adam. Of course, the difference is that Adam was in covenant relationship with Yahweh. End of. That's essentially the big thing about Adam, is that he was given a particular commission and eternal life, minor things like that.
Hmm.
But a particular relationship and a commission that was bigger, I would say, than I agree with you that the Genesis 1 account is a general introduction. Um, and that would allow for man in God's image to be before Adam, and therefore to be a spiritual being as well as an intelligent, cultural, speaking being.
Hmm.
Uh, and yet not in close covenant relationship with Yahweh. Um, and that's, I mean, you're aware, having read John Walton, of the Genesis 1 as the temple account. And
Yeah.
one of the things that struck me from so many different sources was the difference between the temple in Genesis 1, like the tabernacle, in three parts,
Hmm.
separated by a curtain. So the earth is separated from heaven by a veil. And yet in Eden, none of those divisions occur. Um, so it seemed to me that to have a natural religion, a man in which there was a reverence for God, was quite plausible. Lots of questions you can't answer. Will they be in heaven, like Adamic man, or not? I don't think that's our business, but I think it allows you to kind of accommodate the fact that there were bright people around. These were not animals, and also to have a reason why the Adamic line might interbreed with them, so that the whole human race would eventually become like Adam, both in
Mm.
his calling and, of course, in his sin.
Yeah. So theologically, I remember reading Athanasius speaking about like there's a famous line, God became man so that man can become divine,
Yeah,
because that which fits a Trinitarian model in the sense that the only way we can then finally see the Father's face, by which no creature, not even the seraphim or the angels, can even behold his face. Only the Son's seen his face. So the first time a creation can see the Father's face is because the Son decides to incarnate into this particular species to be conformed in his image, by which Jesus is the filter to then see the Father in the new
yeah,
heaven, new earth. So, and that is say the point of Hebrews 2, where obviously David in Psalm 8 is mesmerized by the, like, look how puny we are. What is man that you should take notice of him? But yet
yeah,
you've crowned him with a certain glory and an honor to, rule the creation and so on. But then the author of Hebrews goes, oh, by the way, the second person of the Trinity actually descends down even below the angels, so that,
yeah.
and he becomes like one of us in order to then
It's up.
bring us up to that level. And then there's a throwaway line. He's like, oh, and because he did this, he didn't come to help the angels. He came to help this particular species, which is you and I, out of all the the creatures. But then, if evolution is true, and ultimately, I mean, evolution ultimately deriving from the cosmos itself, that means this even has implications that I've thought about, like say what the early church fathers called the what do they call it? It's to do with ET. Um, there's this particular term. Uh, oh boy, I'll have to bring it up. Can't believe I'm drawing a blank on that. But it's to do with extraterrestrial life, potential other worlds. Let's see.
I've seen that in the Puritans, but not in the Fathers. But take your word for it.
Yes. It's called. The principle of plenitude.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well, the implication of
So I
that.
can't believe I forgot that. So I had to search that
Yeah,
up.
yeah. That's even Darwin believed in that, but he put it back in time. The idea that God would create everything that was possible to create, and so the philosophers, certainly of the Middle Ages, and I guess before that, were expecting that in the world you'd find every species, and that was one of the biggest revolutions when the Copernican revolution came around. Was not that it made the Earth the center of the universe, was that it meant that you might very well find all the missing species on other planets. All the millions of species that God could create would be on other planets, which whether that's true is another matter. But picking up on one of your earlier points, I think one of the key things for me was in the biblical understanding was realizing how much of particularly New Testament teaching is not about the return to Eden. It's not about the world was great, the world became bad, and we can, through Jesus, it can go back. It was this idea of the physical creation and the spiritual creation that Paul refers to a lot, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13, I think, which the whole purpose of Eden was to initiate a conversion of a physical earth into the spiritual earth. And that's the plan that went wrong. That's what kicked off the need for and the provision of salvation history. And what makes the Bible interesting, it's the story of the Bible. Can I quote from a great book by Greg Beale, who in his New Testament theology says the Old Testament storyline that I posit as the basis for the New Testament storyline is this: the Old Testament is the story of God who progressively reestablishes his new creational kingdom out of chaos over a sinful people by his word and spirit through promise, covenant, and redemption, resulting in worldwide commission to the faithful to advance his kingdom and judgment, defeat, or exile for the unfaithful unto his glory. So he sees the Old Testament as being about the new creation. And I think that starts in the garden, which I think is a fascinating concept. And it applies over so many things, over so many passages that one takes for granted, as Romans 8, for example, in which the creation is groaning. And that's usually taken to mean creation is groaning because sin has taken over. But I think it's actually what it's implying is it's groaning because it's being held up from achieving that kind of union with God that the spiritual creation will somehow bring.
So, folks, this is now the book, the sequel to the prior book, The Generations. I like how you put, you pluralized the of heaven and earth, and Adam, so Adam, the ancient world, and biblical theology. And here is just this amazing depiction of, say, the Leviathan, sort of like chaos creature, by which Jesus, who's now shared, in the incarnation, is then kind of like the harrowing of hell, right? He slams the doors of hell. Even it's even humorous because you see the doors squashing the demons underneath, And then
Mhm.
he does like a Terminator, like take my hand if you want to live, and it's like, you know, he then succeeds by pulling them out, right? Um, so now that being said, um, so I'm going to share with you. This is a chart I made that sort of summarizes, say for example, Mike Heiser's work in relation to Walton, Hugh Ross, George Tormados, all these guys, and I think even your work. So when you're talking about billions of years and how you're saying, if you think about it, even the 13.8 billion year universe is like a blip at the end of the day, and even
Yeah.
then, say the last say 100 200,000 years of human history, which then if you truncate that down to just say a mere 10,000 years of the last 10,000 years of say if the flood was anywhere between 12 and 8,000 years, which then leads to modern civilization, which is starting with the ancient Near East, and then say Israelite history starts, say 2000 BC around there, with the calling of Abraham somewhere around there. So in the last say 4,000 years, in that sense, is just a very very tiny blimp. But
Yeah.
that's the amazing point in regards to when you mentioned how um so why did God create? Well, if God is something other and non-created or nothing to do with the physical, that's the amazing thing. If he does exist and is ontologically who he is, the way he is, and then this reality then becomes what it is, that means it's potentially the first thing that's ever happened compared to say the angelic divine council, right? Which then they are witnesses to this creation, and then this big drama transpires, which then brings about this massive epic, which then brings about something like the Old Testament that showcases God versus the gods, and then I suppose you could say the every permutation possible that sin can allow, like every just horrible chaos kampf ridden sin that is, like for example, go read Judges and just see the horrors of what sin can bring about.
Yeah.
And then how you have like critics of the Bible, like say online atheists and critics that'll mock certain laws, and or you mean to say God is commanding these so-called barbaric things, but it's actually ironically, if you look at the bigger picture, there's a de-psychologizing towards basically the Jesus situation to then bring about what Beale argues for, what God originally intended right from the start, but he couldn't do it at the start because if he were to create a perfect thing at the start, he would be creating himself, but that's a contradiction. You can't create an omni being. It has to start very good to then bring about this, the vehicle by which the incarnation is possible for then hypostasis and then finally glorification and theosis. Like that,
Yeah.
that's that trajectory that I've sort of put together as a model. And in this chart, you can see here, so Genesis 1 and 2 is the creation. Then now this is Heiser, who he's pulled in the scholarship in regards to say the Second Temple context and how the Jews considered the falls to take place, and that is, it's not that the creation is falling, rather there's rebellions, and three of them specifically that lead to where the story actually starts, and that's Genesis 12. So Genesis 1 to 11
Yeah.
is like a preface to, okay, here's why we exist as a nation. So that's Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, which is the call of Abraham, which then leads to this Exodus, conquest, kingdom, exile, which then finally, here's Jesus. And then Pentecost, as Beale will communicate, like the whole, the tongues and that whole, like the whirlwind in the upper room, and like all of that is nothing but Ezekiel's vision of the temple realized.
Yeah.
Um, like we wrestle with trying to take the dimensions of that in a literal way, but Beale beautifully connects every feature of Ezekiel's eschatological temple as being basically the birth of the church moving forward in Acts 2 moving forward. Like, so in a nutshell, this is so this chart here is thoroughly, say, biblical, No, I'm not including any concordist science in this chart. Let's see what the Bible communicates chronologically when you take the whole thing as one massive, uh, big picture, perspective. Then your
Well,
particular work
yeah,
sort of like is what I wanted to do by then bringing in the science, but more so in regards to origins. But that then connects to the
yeah.
once a story starts. Yeah.
I mean, it's science light, that book. Apart from uh, looking at things like the possible site of the flood, this kind of thing, the
Yep.
possible site of Eden. But in terms of the contentious parts of science, apart from the genealogical Adam and Eve, I left that aside, which is why
Yep.
Joshua was doing it. But the particular line I took on the narrative of the Bible was to see it as a narrative, as a story for mankind, and of a classic folk story type. If you think of the Genesis 1, the creation, as thus the setting, once upon a time there was a king who lived in a wood. You're not asking any questions about that. It's just, here's the situation we start with. And there are these three movements of it, really, where God makes a plan, which is apparently stymied in Genesis 3, move forward to the call of Abraham and therefore the story of Israel, which is the second, as it were, attempt in narrative terms to solve this problem set up by the first failure.
Mm-hmm.
That ends in the exile, but at the very same time, the promise of the new covenant comes, and along comes Jesus as the hero, the third one in the line, who brings it to fruition. And that seemed to me quite a dramatic potted account of how the Bible works, which for every age and every human being can make sense once you actually see the pattern. And of course, at the end, everything that God attempted to do in that first movement to glorify man, to bring him into relationship with himself, is fulfilled, the creation as well. The enemy who dealt problems to it, Satan, is destroyed and his work is confounded. And it's just a really good story, actually, when you look at it that way.
Yeah, just quickly, when you're speaking about how every culture, like to paraphrase what you just said that moment ago in regards to God working with every culture and that sense, that's another thing I do get a little bit frustrated with, like say in study groups amongst Christians who don't seem to ask the obvious question in regards to how each biblical book is, ironically, but at the same time, we shouldn't be surprised by how each book is relevant for that culture, because how else is God going to communicate to that culture? So in other words, Ezekiel, he uses Babylonian iconography in the opening of the book. It would be anachronistic to think that God's theophany to Ezekiel applies to, say, the burning bush theophany and the Egyptian polemics that's taking place with Egyptian deities in Moses' time. That's it. So if Jesus is the same yesterday, today, forever, well, here we go. Let's put that to the test. He is the same, and yet because he's omni, that's why he's able to, the Blessed Trinity is able to accommodate each culture relative to the evolution of humans psychologically, language, culture. Then Greek, like, the language of Greek is now sufficient enough to then communicate Platonic concepts of God, because the Logos concept is too complex for, say, Moses, the language of Moses and so on to accommodate. So it's like, by the time you reach, Jesus, it's, there we go. Now, yeah.
There are so many aspects of that. I mean, and understanding the early chapters of Genesis, the proto-history, and the creation account. one of the early articles I did, which got into the book indirectly, was the realization that there was no concept of air before the Greeks invented it.
Right.
So when you're talking about the firmament, what's between earth and heaven, as far as the ancient world was concerned, it wasn't a question. It was a space. You didn't have to think about air. What's the other one? Even the New Testament concept of adoption, which is another rich thing that Paul uses, that came from the Roman world. Adoption is a concept that really wasn't around in Hebrew times. So as you say, not only is it relevant to each culture, but the whole message grows because of the bringing on board of the different cultures, which even astrology, if you're a Mike Heiser fan, or astrotheology, I think he calls it, doesn't he?
Yeah, astrotheology, yeah. Or archaeoastrology, something like that. Like,
and that's when I've done Bible studies on Daniel, pointed out that he was a professional. Essentially, he was a professional fortune teller. I mean, that's what his day job was, to read the omens, to read the signs, to read the dreams, and presumably he did that very well. It somehow holding that in the context of faithfulness to God and to His law, which he did a good job. But you can see that again, that Babylonian influence comes out in the visions that he sees.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a fascinating paper by a guy named Al Walters, where he proposes that in Daniel 12, where it says we'll shine like, it says in the singular, like the great luminary, supposedly that's Halley's Comet. And curiously, if you, I mean, Al Walters wants to propose, Daniel in the Maccabean sort of period, because Halley's Comet actually was visible in the Maccabean context. But I hold to a 6th century composition, and I'm open to a redactional editing into the Maccabean. But there's potential for Halley to be in 540 BC, which actually is 3 years before Daniel dies, I think, is around his death date. So, and if it's in 540 BC, then here you go. Here's a potential for Daniel to be talking about it. Because you see these when these things appear in the text, it's again very specific, culture centered, very specific terms. It's not just common terms that can appear just commonly. Like you'll start to notice blips in the Bible that are boom, here we go. Here's a specific word because a certain phenomenon is happening at that moment. But then we see the same thing, like if we expand this out to something like, say, the Book of Nature, you have epochs in Earth's history, which so when it comes, now this is something I'll probably ask you now, like, I like to think of, say, Genesis 1 as being an ancient Near Eastern polemic. Yes, there are, and I see it in your text as well, where you've spoken about how Walton or people like Walton can go a bit too far into thinking that the Rakia is specifically, solid.
Not a Rakia fan myself.
Yeah, like I mean, I agree with him, but at the same time, I want to. The interesting thing is he's actually backed off that argument. I don't know if you're aware of this. So, in Lost World of Adam and Eve, there's a footnote where he goes, in Lost World of Genesis 1, I did argue that Rakia is solid, but now I've recanted from that. I've retracted that claim because the concept of Rakia being solid we can't argue that for anymore, basically. And he went through like a linguistic argument for that. So in Lost World of Adam and Eve, he upgraded his argument, pulled
it's
away
nice
from
to see
Genesis
he
1.
agreed with me. But I did correspond with him once on a different matter. But I see Genesis 1 as being purely phenomenological. That is, and not purely phenomenological with a temple creation theme. So as far as nature's concerned, he's describing what you see, maybe from Mount Sinai or from the world. He's describing the world that that we live in.
Are you borrowing this from, say, Seth Postel?
Oh, probably from nearly everyone, but
Okay.
particularly
Yep.
from my memory and my grandchildren. I got a lovely picture, which I haven't got to hand, that my 4-year-old granddaughter did, and knowing that she was pre-educated, she had not been educated into any science. She was just living in the world, and so I sort of talked to her about it deliberately, to kind of try and pick up what a naive view of the world is. And you know how children's pictures have the
Yep.
blue sky along as a strip along the top, the green at the bottom, and in the middle there's a house and some birds and a sun usually. Very much, well, I think it's very much like the Genesis 1 account. And I was asking her, well, what are the birds in the sky? She said, oh yes, the birds are in the sky. I said, but the sky is that blue bit at the top, isn't it? And the ambiguity between the sky as being something that seems to be up there, a thing, a blue thing, and being anything above you. Because the house was the same level of the birds, but the house wasn't in the sky. You see what I mean? I said, how far do you think the ground goes down? And she didn't have any idea of that, hadn't thought about it, And then I sort of said, well, what about the sun? How far do you think the world goes that way? And again, oh no, I haven't thought about that. It's just the sky is up, ground is down, and the seaside's over there somewhere. We go in the car. And eventually she offered, I think it might be round. And I think that was her education coming out, because somebody had told her the world is round. So she was thinking of a saucer. And it was just,
Yeah.
but she wasn't thinking the world was flat. She was just thinking the ground is down, the sky is up, we're in the middle, which is what Genesis says. And I think there's this lovely interplay between the Exodus account of the creation of the tabernacle, which is presumably what Moses saw first before I think the Genesis, the creation account was Moses' original contribution. I don't think he took it from the Genesis 2 to 11 corpus, but he was consciously echoing in the tabernacle the world, and consciously echoing in the world, a description of the world, the tabernacle, because that they belong together. The world is God's temple. The cosmos is God's temple. I think it's a lovely concept, and so my 4-year-old granddaughter was a major source for that.
I'll show you here. This is so that people can see where this is going. So Seth Postel, actually, in his work, Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus. Are you familiar with this particular book?
Which is the book?
It's called Reading
No,
Moses, Seeing
I've got
Jesus.
another of his books, but not that one. Adam as Israel.
So this is right. So this is, I think, his most latest work, but he goes into God's first priest, which is stuff you've spoken about, and here's particularly the parallels between creation and the tabernacle. So exactly the same Hebrew terms where God finishes his work, then Moses finished the work. There's an inspection of the creation, inspection of the tabernacle. There's benediction, Spirit of God. So yeah, I completely agree with you, and it's obvious that we can see these
There's
parallels
another thing.
because
Another thing that you might cover, that if you read the Exodus account, when they're putting the tabernacle together, having made all the bits, it's kind of slightly bizarre. They start off with the Holy of Holies, and then build the rest.
Oh no, that's right. No, that's the Holy of Holies first.
Is set out first,
Yeah.
then the account, then the outer wall. You think, well, if it was me, I'd sort of put the fence round first, then build the church, and then put the Holy of Holies in the middle. But it mirrors the Genesis account. The heavens come first, and then the earth.
Yeah, and the colors. That's another thing people don't seem to make the connection. It goes from a blue inside where the Holy of Holies is to a red right at the outs, and and then the ancients, like just a small little cut, and obviously blood comes out, but it's red. So hence this ancient depiction of, well, are we? So we are red beings. So
Oh,
are we
yeah.
red, right? Which then, and then all see
Absolutely.
blue. That's where heaven is. That's where God is. So there's this transition, so to speak, but from these very simple, conceptual, picture images and
The overall thing, of course, is that Genesis is so rich. Um, we're
right.
doing Genesis 1 to 11 at my church, and funnily, I haven't been asked to teach on it, even probably because I've written 2 books on it. I might
Hmm.
gum up the works. But
Yeah.
just taken as from somebody else's point of view, stuff I hadn't thought of before in reading Genesis, just so rich at every level.
Mm.
Incredible book.
What's your thoughts on Hugh Ross's Concordism? Because so when I became a Christian in 2015, so my journey started in 2010. My Opa passed away in 2010, and the funeral moment actually triggered, because my mind, I could be on the spectrum. I don't know, like, but from that emotional moment, like touching his cold forehead, triggered a sort of like an analytical moment, or
Mhm.
like in all these things are just flowing my mind at light speed, but at the same time in an instant. Which then I asked the question, God, if you exist, and I'm an atheist, but if you exist, and this man was a Christian, why? Like what? And then I'm hearing this message about the gospel and so on, and it's just all really confusing to me. So I asked 2 questions. If God exists, what's the most efficient means he can demonstrate his existence? In the weeks to come, I was thinking about that question a lot, and I was thinking, well, he would have to do some sort of like. So I'm a huge fan of, say, the Matrix movie, where
Totally.
Morpheus comes into the system. Otherwise, Neo would not be aware of Morpheus, so he has to come in. But then, if he does that, yeah, that would be cool. Kind of like a pink elephant. If a pink elephant appears, that would be interesting. But then after a while, it becomes
A
common.
1,000 foot high Jesus, as Dawkins, or one of the Jerry Coyne, wasn't it? Wanted a
Right.
1,000 foot high Jesus.
But it would just become common. It'll be like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
there's just like how again in the Matrix movie, as you transition through the movies, you start to become very familiar with the characters, and it's like, oh yeah, it's common. So for me, the big question, which is the reason why I became a Christian, is okay, if you reveal yourself by coming into the system, there's still an issue within the system, and that is not just death within the system, but the system itself is death,
Mm.
like the system as a whole. So, what's your response to this? I hypothesize that he would have to have some sort of ontological joining somehow to upgrade it. Just like in the Matrix movie, Neo, through the machine mainframe, is able to
Yeah.
obliterate all the Smiths and resurrect the Matrix. It's like, did you do something like this? And I'm looking at all the religions, and there's no deity anywhere that has this incarnating aspect. But then when I'm seeing the Christian message, that spooked me, and I'm thinking, is there something to this? Like, you can't just latch onto it just because it fits my hypothesis. So the 5 years was just looking into that to see if it's true. And so then when I came across Hugh Ross and Mike Heiss and all that in 2013, 2014, around there, I so coming back to the creation context, I was fascinated with Hugh Ross's Concordism because I'm already familiar with Walton's approach. I'm already familiar with the polemics and very comfortable with the polemics. Like, in other words, if Genesis 1 is nothing but like a copy of and pasting of, say, Marduk and Tiamat and the warring, like the Enuma Elish and all those other creation myths, and that the author is deliberately acting like an atheist in writing. So, for example, when it says, "And God made the 2 great lights, the
Yeah.
bigger light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night." I mean, but that in itself is bad grammar because you don't call the sun the big light,
Right. Yeah.
you know. But I mean, the normal word would be Shemesh, which is the sun deity. But if you put Shemesh in there, then you're giving some sort of credence to Shemesh. So just to
Absolutely.
deliberately avoid Shemesh, the greater light. which so then because notice I'm an atheist looking at the scholarship and seeing the polemics, and I'm thinking to myself, but that's something Richard Dawkins would do. If he went back in time, he wouldn't say that's Shemesh. He'd say that's to because polemically he would want to communicate to the culture that that's not some deity out there; it's a natural
Yeah.
object. So he would use terminology to try and deprogram their superstition. And so, but that's what I'm seeing in the Genesis creation account. So I'm used to the polemics in that sense. But then when I'm looking at, say, the Concordist approach, I can't help but go, hang on, but I like when I see chronologically Earth's conditions starting from like a watery, well, Hadean epoch, but then it becomes like a water world, and then
Yeah.
these epochs, and then Cambrian in day 5, which this is I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Basil the
Only
Great.
vaguely, not from reading Ross, but
Okay.
it's one of those things. In fact, in my Bible study this last week, somebody was
Hmm.
saying, like, it's amazing how Genesis 1 follows what science has said about the origin of the earth. And I think, I'm not sure it does.
Yeah.
Because I've, in what was available to me reading Genesis over most of my life, that idea that Genesis broadly follows the what we know of the history of our planet. And I think it doesn't kind of quite work. And I think it's a genre thing. I don't think personally that there's much to be gained from trying to read a geological, paleontological history of the Earth into that text. I don't think it helps you much, especially in terms of trying to actually say this is God's world, and this is the world that worships God. Where God is worshipped by creation. In a way, that's all you need to know. I
But
think the
I'll just quickly point this out to you though. Like I was fascinated to see Basil the Great. There's a Talmudic uh, commentary as well. Uh, Second Temple texts like First and Second Enoch, all the way up to the Reformation period, like John Calvin, Luther, all the way up to Philip Schaff in 1800. So I'm giving you these like points in history about Genesis 1 verse 20. All of them up until Philip Schaff, and I'll get to Philip Schaff in a moment, but all of them were freaked out by this notion that the the Septuagint specifically brings us out even more that the birds originate from the waters.
Yeah.
And Basil was confused by this, and he actually goes down this tangent, going, "Wait, do birds and fish have a relationship, like some sort of family? Like I'm not kidding." He says maybe they are of one family, because see, fish seem to swim in the water just as the birds seem to swim in the air, right? Because birds also
Yeah.
have fins per se. And then John Calvin, in his Genesis commentary, says there are atheists in my day making a mockery of this. Let God's let who are you, oh man, to argue against God? Like and then Philip Schaff, who's translating the church father material, there's a little footnote he puts in there going, oh, by the way, this is what now in light of evolution, like birds, dinosaurs, fish, dinosaurs, birds. So
Yeah.
um,
That mammals came before
yeah,
birds. So, yeah, no.
right, right,
But I
yeah,
think I think it's elegant. I mean, in my understanding,
hmm
the waters above the firmament are quite simple. The Hebrews knew that clouds were wet, and there's a percentage of the Earth's water is up there in the heavens, above. If we treat the kind of the space as the sky in that naive way, then the clouds are up there, and they are the waters above the firmament. So they're going to have their own creatures, and those creatures are the birds that fly in the firmament. So both day, whatever it is, day 5, isn't it? Day
hmm
5 is the creatures of the waters, and it's the waters above the firmament and the waters below the firmament. And that's a problem if you're getting a solid rack here and a cosmic ocean.
right, right,
but I don't believe that was ever in the text, and I
And
don't think it's.
you're putting a framework like day one, day four, day two, day five,
Yeah, yeah,
day three, day
yeah,
like you're applying it that
yeah.
way. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
One of the things I hadn't tweaked until recently was that if you take the tohu wabohu as formless and empty, the first 3 days are form, and the second 3 days are things to fill those forms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he's, in the two halves of creation, he's answering uh, the formlessness and the emptiness, which I think is elegant as well.
Mm.
Another small interpretive point that's valuable.
Yeah.
So
Um.
lights occupy the heavens, the birds occupy the birds and the fish occupy the waters,
Mhm.
and the animals and man occupy the earth.
Sweet.
Easy peasy.
Okay. So I I don't know if anyone has like, are you interested in audience questions? If anyone has
Well, by all
questions,
means.
we can bring them up. So while the questions come in, do you have any questions for me? Because I don't know what else to ask you. It's like I feel like we're on the same page with so many things.
Right. So
So
thank you for reading the book. That's really good. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, let's see. I think there's also like near the end, like in chapter 17, the devil and all his works,
Yeah.
the psychology of Satan, and have you looked into how I think Heise is the only one that actually brings this out the most out of all the scholarship I've read, and that is this principle that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 8, that what God planned before the creation, he planned for our glory, that none of the rulers of this world, literally the archons of this aeon, this age, understood it, because if they had, they would not have killed Jesus. So, so Satan killing Jesus was ironically, um, he shot himself in the foot.
Yeah.
He
Absolutely.
like
What
yeah.
what I well, I don't know. I tried to do it. What seemed to emerge was the realization that the old theory of atonement, the ransom theory, actually has a lot going for it once you tie the atonement closely in to the Eden story. Because in Eden, what actually seems to happen is that Satan, as it were, thinks he's got one over on God, in with the aim of getting rid of this upstart man who's going to be put in charge of him when he's been happily in charge of things until now.
Mm,
Um, so the situation is that he has got God's promise or warning that man will die if he breaks the commandment. Um, God fully intends that he's actually going to overcome that somehow. But in
mm,
the meantime, what Satan has, whenever his own position might be threatened, Satan has the ability to say to God, "Look at those sinners. Uh, you know, and if you're going to do anything about me, you've got to do something about them." And of course, that's why Satan is uh, the the accuser by definition. That's the meaning of his name. He
mhm,
accuses us before God, partly because that gets rid of us, but also because it enables him to avoid judgment. Jesus comes and deals with our sin and gives God every right to then finally deal with Satan, who hasn't got a defense to stand on. Sin has been dealt with, and his own sins can be judged, if that makes sense.
mm,
And that's really what the ransom theory was saying, I think, and wasn't as silly as many people seem to think.
mm. I mean, you bring up here Colossians 2:14 and 15, which reads, having erased the charges that were brought against us. Or, I mean, I use the ISV here. It's one of my, like, the translators have made the ESV, NIV, NASB. They made this brand new translation, the ISV.
Mm.
Just a quick little tangent point. For example, Genesis 3:1 in the ISV says, "Now the shining one was more wise than the other animals. So they take Nakash there as like
They've read
Heiser
Heiser,
basically.
yeah.
Yeah. So, but the ISV says having erased the charges that were brought against us, but I still like the ESV rendering of that where it says having blotted out that record of debt,
Yeah.
taking that record of debt, putting it on the cross. But verse 15, when he had disarmed the rulers and the authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in the cross. And it's like, and the scholars will bring this out, but Paul is saying you have a Roman procession, how when they would
Mm.
defeat nations, they would make a mockery of their enemy through the streets, so to speak.
Yeah.
So here Jesus is making a mockery of say the corpse or the carcass of Leviathan, like this, the mockery of the principality and power. And yeah, like that is in essence. So William Lane Craig, in his new book on the historical Adam, sort of
Yeah.
goes with the Christus Victor theory and the ransom theory, and like actually marries the two. And yeah, like again, you've even before Craig released his book, it's like you're basically saying the same thing in this passage.
Well, he did.
Yeah.
He did read my draft before his book came out, which I'm sure was not an influence because he wasn't
Okay.
keen on the genealogical Adam.
Oh, so he
concept.
read your book.
Sorry?
Did he
Well,
read
he
your
should have
book?
read it. I mean, he got it.
Okay.
We were in correspondence before it went to publishing.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I was hoping he'd do an endorsement. Then he said he didn't believe in the genealogical Adam and Eve, so he didn't do an endorsement. So
Right.
But
Right.
but he goes for an ancient Adam, which I find many problems with that theologically. Because
You mean Craig's position of Adam going hundreds of thousands of years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Apart from anything else, it seems to mean that you have to focus just on that passage and divorce it from the proto history afterwards. Where do you put Cain and Abel? You can't put them as herdsmen and whatever. You have problem dealing with Cain building a city in Paleolithic times.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, and also it means that there's an economy. Where Peter says God is not slow, as some count slowness. There's an economy in the history, the salvation history. It's done as quickly as is right. But it would seem odd that if Adam fell in 500,000 BC, then to wait 500,000 years with no solution until Abraham comes along. You think, well, that does seem slow to me,
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So I think to have Adam does fit into history, not prehistory. I think it's a question of inspiration as well, because there's the possibility of a tradition coming down for up to a few thousand years. There's no possibility whatsoever of a tradition coming back from 500,000 years. So it would just basically be inspiration by dictation, like the Quran, which is not the way
Which is not exactly.
It's not the way that inspiration works.
And so I'm in a complete agreement, because my only criticism of Craig's book. So ironically enough, Craig holds to the Persian Gulf stuff, all that stuff, right? So there was the ASA board review on Zoom with Craig in their presence, like listening to their critiques of his work, and Josh Swamidos was actually in also listening in, and I actually in private told Josh, hey, they're being a little bit unfair with Craig here, and Josh agreed. The only criticism I have, which I've spoken to Josh about this, is that exactly what you said, that if you put Adam all the way back, there's this massive lag. In other words, Craig, let's just put Adam recent, which is Genesis 2, and put Genesis 1 as being 100,000+ years ago. And now everything fits because now you
Yeah,
have that. So,
yeah,
but that's
I
the
agree.
model that I already held to, which, as I can see over here, what you argue for over here, and how you argue that the flood will be that Persian Gulf, which then where the Ark lands, and then that Eurasia, the farming that takes place in that Armenian mountain range area,
Yeah,
and
I mean
so.
the Persian Gulf. The idea of a fixed and known geographical location for Eden uh, just strikes me from the Sodom and Gomorrah episode,
Hmm.
where in Genesis, the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is presumably north of the Dead Sea on recent archaeological findings,
Hmm.
is said to resemble both Zoar in Egypt, which is in the Delta, of course, and the Garden of God. So you've got two deltas, the Jordan Delta and the Nile Delta, being compared directly in its nature with the Garden of God, which
Hmm.
absolutely fits the Tigris Euphrates lower Iraqi area um, at some time in prehistory, because you've got a tremendously complicated reworking of the coastline and things there, which is why I'm interested in your guy who was talking about a possible sort of sandbar and a breaching of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the sort of thing that's actually eminently possible, I think, given that it's very difficult to judge how that coastline has changed from millennium to millennium.
Mm. There's okay. You just triggered. I know we're gonna get to questions in a moment, but you just triggered another parallel that I can share with you. There's a there's an Ugaritic scholar named Edward Lipinski who Heiser cites. He wrote a 50-page journal article called L's Abode. I'll get the full. Let's see here, Lipinski. Um, Here we go. I'll just let that load. So basically, in this paper, he argues that Hermon, which is in Israel, which Heiser argues is the mountain that Jesus transfigures on, because that's in Second Temple thinking that's the ground zero for hell. The gates of hell is in that location.
Yeah,
So here's the full title of it: Elsbode, mythological traditions related to Mount Hermon and to the mountains of Armenia. 58 pages long. It's a fascinating read. What he wants to argue here is why in Genesis 6 verse 4, when it says that the Nephilim potentially, and there's a big debate, are the Nephilim connected to the sons of God and the daughters of men, or is it sort of another subgroup that is
mm,
simultaneously existing while the sons of God and daughters of men are doing their thing? And Jeff Rose actually, from a most a naturalistic point of view, argues that the reason why they're the Gibborim, or the giants, is because these are a people group that were able to digest milk, and hence they were able to grow. Because I mean, and it makes sense in a way, and he argues this in that book that he's just published, that there's an isolated group that there's a certain gene that mutated for them to digest
yeah,
milk,
yeah,
to
that's a
grow taller, and
lactose intolerance.
yeah, right. And so, but but coming back to Heiser, through this particular work, basically the question is, why does God then have Canaan on his radar always, starting with Abraham? Well, if the flood is local, and if you have Nephilim mythology taking place in the Persian Gulf region, there's a migration west to where Canaan is, and then the chase is on. Because if the Nephilim are indeed connected to, say, Satan ultimately, then there's this chase towards the eradication of the, Satan, Nephilim, all that stuff, which leads to Joshua's wars, and so
Yeah, I come
that
across
those
that.
those parallel connections you made there, it's like there's another parallel connection, not related to your connection, but at the same time you can see these sort of like these parallels where the mountain abode in Eden, which is Persian Gulf region, that Armenian context. Now you have the same sort of parallel happening here in like Canaan area. So similar to what you see in like in Psalm 68 with where the psalmist compares Sinai to Bashan, like the Sinai mountain and the mountain Bashan, which God ascends to take the captives, and then Paul quotes that psalm in Ephesians 4. Jesus is the one that ascends and descends, and
Yeah.
so yeah.
There
All
is
right.
plenty. Are you got any questions?
Yeah. Yes. All right. Questions. Let's see. Lucas asks, where does John stand in agreement and disagreement with Dr. Collins?
This is Jack Collins.
Yep.
Well, we corresponded. We were in fairly close contact while I was writing it, because he was involved with. How did I get in touch with him? Must have been Peaceful Science, Joshua Swamidas's website. But I think the main point of actual disagreement. I mean, there were different understandings, and obviously, most of what he's written was before the genealogical Adam and Eve concept came out. The main disagreement is that on textual grounds, he takes Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as being restating the same events.
And that's my disagreement as well. But like even Hugh Ross makes the argument. I'm like,
I mean, he does it on textual grounds, and
yeah.
It led me to kind of work on the possibility. I mean, it would fit with my overall thesis. It would just leave you still wondering where early man came in. And it's quite legitimate for the Bible not to mention early man, because if it was interested, if the Bible is interested in Adam's race leading through Abraham and across the world, the first man who has the Spirit of God on him in that way, then it doesn't have to mention anyone else. I just think it's rather neat that Genesis 1 seems to allow a place for giving a theological understanding of early man in relation to what makes Adam different from any old hominin. Yeah.
The strength of his argument. Sorry?
That's the only point at which I
right.
sort of significantly disagreed with Jon Collins.
Mm-hmm. No, I can't think of anything else. One of the main strengths I think he does make is in Genesis 2. He speaks about the past tense in when it says like, and God made the animals and so on. Like people try and say, oh, but see, the creation is in a reverse order. So the irony here is Jack Collins actually argues for in the grammar, it's actually speaking the past tense. God had made, in Genesis 1. But then this comes back to your argument, which is also my argument, and that is, but then that's why Genesis 2 happens to be a sequel. It's not, you can't make it a restatement, right? So, yeah. Okay, let's see here. Tui asks, could Garvey talk about Augustinian Adam versus Irenaean Adam, mature and righteous, almost superhuman Adam versus Irenaeus' immature, undeveloped, but still otherwise innocent Adam?
Yeah. Somewhere there's an article I did showing that the idea that that the profound disagreement between Augustine and Irenaeus didn't really exist. That both of them see a place for original sin by different names. I think I don't think Irenaeus. Yeah, if they were talking together, I think they would both agree that Adam and Eve had not yet learnt all they were supposed to learn from God. and in that sense they're immature. But it doesn't make them non-blameworthy. And Irenaeus doesn't excuse their sin. He talks, when he goes on from describing the fall, to talk about their race being imprisoned. And his aim is to show that Adam was saved, because if the children who are in prison are released from prison, it would be unjust of God not to release the parent too. So he's clearly got this idea that sin is not just Adam's problem, it's Adam's offspring's problem. But he stresses in his, partly to blame Satan, to show how Satan deceived the woman first and then Adam, was that they were immature, they were not versed in the ways of the world. That's just the emphasis of one particular passage. Augustine's aim in writing was a different one. It was to show the nature of evil, and that wasn't what Irenaeus was trying to do. So somewhere on academia, there's my article on that, which shows really that there's no great space between them. I think it's been overemphasized in modern theology, particularly from what's the name of the guy? That's a name that escapes me too. But on Biologos, they're always talking about the immaturity concept, because it enabled them to see an evolutionary view of religion. I think that sort of religion originally naive and primitive and selfish, and this kind of evolutionary progress through to salvation. And that's not what the Bible teaches.
Are you familiar with this book, John?
No,
by
I'm
Peter
not.
Harrison. He's an Australian academic dealing with basically he's a historian of science, and he's a Christian, but specializing in how, science as we understand it from the 1500s, how that even emerged to begin with from Reformation Europe. So like Thomas Torrance was one of the big names in that sort of thinking in the last century. But Peter Harrison is currently written multitude of texts on this. This is one of my favorite. This is about a 2005 one where he actually says what you just said there in your answer. The fall of man and foundations of science, and this tension that Tui is getting at. That in other words, he's just as how you're trying to showcase that if both of them were to meet, right, they wouldn't contradict each other, because the sign or the way people were psychologizing the fall and the potency, as Augustine would put it, the potency in our minds, to like how far can we go basically. So Peter Harrison lays out the groundwork to say that our mind is simultaneously superhuman and innocent and immature, in the sense that the plasticity of it is that the fall is the reason why we ought to do the scientific method, because we are not we are not perfect, we are imperfect, but the scientific method will continuously reform us towards going towards that superhuman position in a constant like rinse repeat sort of like cycle forward. So
one way to see the Irenaeus issue is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So they were not intended not to be wise. The tree was forbidden them because they did not yet know God well enough and had not received wisdom at his hand. So you could view what Irenaeus is saying as, if they had stayed with God and obeyed his command, which is simple, doesn't take a deal of intelligence to obey a command, they would have then taken one step towards God. And as time went by, as those lessons increased, had Satan come along with the same accusation, it would never have worked. because they would have been mature believers. So perhaps that's one way of avoiding the trap of just thinking of it's letting them off the hook. They were responsible, but they had not yet learned the lessons they were supposed to learn. They had not grown in wisdom enough to resist Satan. So he was doubly to blame because he exploited their immaturity.
I love how you put that. Love how you worded that. One step towards God versus, basically one step towards Satan, which is, again, Peter Harrison's point. That is, science is all about one step towards the logos, hence right thinking. And if you're going the other way, then you're just devolving to, not right thinking, so non-science. Like, yeah, it's just incredible. Like just that simple concept, right, can spur on psychologically something like then the scientific revolution to then, go the way it went. Yeah. Let's see here. How much time do you have left, by the way?
Oh, it's only 5 to 10 here.
Okay.
I'm not working.
Yeah. Let's see. There seems to be like some sort of discussion going on in the side there. No more questions by the looks of it.
Okay.
Are there any, like, well, for example, there is this particular comment. I don't know if you want to, it's not really a question, but this is part of the side discussion that's happening. But as someone who is personally dealing with belief issues, I think most people that reach out, even in a mocking way, do it because they truly want to know if Christianity is true. If it is, I just think sometimes their heart is a bit hardened towards it because no one has been able to help with that yet. Maybe, I mean, this could be like sort of like an evangelical moment, evangelizing moment. But when I became a Christian, it was I'll just be honest, like since 2015, I suppose you could say I've had emotional softening of the heart, emotional, spiritual sort of like euphoria. But my mind is such that the euphoria still ultimately stems from the logical reasoning.
Yeah.
So like if I derive, say, Einstein's field equations, with high math like calculus and all that, like there's a euphoria when I see the math work. And then not just the math work like in a purely logical sense, but even when you see it working in nature. So I've never had where I can just, like in church, I've never raised my hands up and I've never like zoned out and like what you see in, say, charismatic circles. Like I've never done that. I can never relate with that. So but I know that feeling in the sense that I have that. I suppose I have that feeling, but when it's data driven. Has that been your experience? Like how's your worship?
Much the same. I
Okay.
I lead worship, and no, I try to get away from the idea of worship, music particularly, as being necessarily emotional. I think there's kind of a lot of manipulation that can happen there. I agree with you. We had in my Bible study the other day, there was a question, when have you felt really close to God? I think they put it as transparent moments or thin moments, when you really felt close to God. And people saying, oh, in worship or when I'm in nature. And I sort of said, well, very often it's when I'm reading a book and there's this idea either about God or nature or the world that actually just grabs me and you think, wow. And that to me is probably the commonest pattern. But I think there are other times. There have been times when I've been reading, say, the Bible, and then suddenly a flash of insight, something
Mm,
on that I've never seen there before, and you think that feels like a supernatural moment.
mm,
Um,
mm.
and then there was the time I had a near-death experience, but that's another story.
Okay, okay.
um,
Hmm.
but I think essentially there are horses for courses. There are people are going to relate to God in different ways. There are people who are inquiring, and sometimes hurt people who are inquiring. And you can normally tell those if you, I mean, I do a blog and you do this channel, but
Hmm.
when you're discussing with people, you can tell when people are hurting when they're searching and when they're just trying to score points. And there's usually a profound difference.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
um, so wish your person well in their search, and hope the discussion tonight shows that the whole of human experience ties together in Christ.
Mhm.
The science does, nature does when you get out amongst it. Human relationships do, death does when you lose
Mm,
someone close to you. That's often your own experience. That's a time often when God is very close in a paradoxical way. Yeah, but God will reach out if you reach out to Him one way or the other.
and just, again, I love how you just said that. Like in Job or in other places where it speaks about God is ever so near,
Mm.
and I again my mind goes into analogies like, say, if the flatland analogies. So you have flatlanders,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
if this three-dimensional being which is up here, even if he comes like a Planck length above, they still don't know that he's there. He has to enter in flatland to be like, hey, here I am, which includes no which no other god has done, and that is it also includes death.
Yeah.
So you're not alone when you're alive, like in everything. When you're giving analogies of like when you're out in nature or if you're reading something. So okay, God is around in those situations. Now imagine a God that is not with you in death.
Mm. It will not do.
How interesting! It's only the Christian God that's in that. Are you familiar with a hymn? A World War I soldier wrote this hymn called "Jesus of the Scars," and
No.
John Stott put it in his book "The Cross of Christ."
So
Um,
I am familiar with it because I've read the book, but I can't remember it.
okay, uh, I'll just bring up. So John Stott. This is John Stott's favorite um, uh, hymn, and so I'll just bring it up here. And it's actually my favorite when I in my search. So this is how it goes. It's by a guy named Edward Shillito. So he goes, if we have never sought, we seek thee now. Thine eyes burn through the dark, are only stars. We must have sight of thorn pricks on thy brow. We must have thee, O Jesus of the scars. The heavens frighten us, they are too calm. Like I just love this because especially in World War I, with all the chaos and carnage surrounding him, um, you would think gunfire would be frightening, but what's frightening is that the heavens are too calm
Mm.
in the midst of all that noise. So in all the universe, we have no place. Our wounds are hurting us. Where is the balm? Lord Jesus, by thy scars we claim thy grace. If when the doors are shut, thou drawest near, only reveal those hands, that side of thine. We know today what wounds are, have no fear. Show us thy scars, we know the countersign. Now this is the bit that really got to me. The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds only God's wounds can speak, and not a god has wounds but thou alone. So
Mm.
again, in light of Heiser's work, Divine Council stuff, all the other gods of the nations, all of that, it's like this is the only deity in the entire history of the universe that demonstrates, like Romans 5, God demonstrates his love for while we were yet enemies and
That's true.
sinners, Christ died for us. Like it's that, like, so, and here's the carnage of war that he's experiencing. He can see the wounds in his body, the ultimate wound, the ultimate sting, death. And then how does Paul end in 1 Corinthians 15? It's like he makes this huge argumentation, and he's like, well, now rejoice, because where grave is your victory, where death is your sting. It's been swallowed up in life.
I wonder, when
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis was converted, his big problem was believing in God. And once he believed in God, he says that Christianity more or less followed on as a logical consequence. And I wonder if much of the problem that people have is because of the indoctrination. It's the natural state of man to believe in God. This is where I disagreed with Josh Schwamilas on the scientific thing, because his idea was that God is well hidden in nature. You can't see God, and he's hiding himself, and trying to explain why he hides himself. And I said, well, the scripture doesn't say that he hides himself, it says he's showing himself. Our problem is that we have interpreted over several centuries the world in a way that writes God out of it. Obviously, evolutionary theory being the classic example of that. We do not need God, and that makes it hard to believe in God. I guess the challenge of Christianity, if you do believe in God, is that how do I find God personally? How do I know God? And it's that Jesus speaks to particularly. But we do have to recognize that we have centuries of indoctrination to overcome, to believe the possible, what every child I think knows until a certain age. I know what your experience of an atheist was, but whether you remember when you became one, or whether you just never.
Well, I was born in '88 in India. I left India in '97. I was the age of 9. I remember weird stuff from the age of 5 till 9. That period, I would even suspect potentially supernatural, ranging from weird dreams, but even at that young age, I recognized the patterns of when these things would happen relative to the supernatural Hindu, what you would call demonic stuff that's taking place. So those events or those dreams or those experiences were in direct proportion to whenever those events transpired just outside my home. Certain festivals of the year, and so, but I was still, I suppose I suppose you could say, like an atheist. My family being Christian, but they never forced anything onto me. They just encouraged, just read this, read that. They had like a vast library to draw from. Coming to Australia, I remember that night. It's cold. It's a bit too clean. The air seems a bit too clean. Like you can smell the cleanness of the air. It's weird. It's like it's just totally, it's too pristine, right? And there's nothing on the road. There's no cows and people, and it's just. And then we're looking for, like, so my family's mostly Anglican, so we're looking for like an Anglican church, and walking into the local Anglican church, even that was a bit too clean. It's too, there's no chaos, there's no random noise or randomly people coming in, barging in, and it's just everything seems in order, which then I suppose you could say instilled a sense of apathy,
Right.
where for the next until the age of 20. So my old papa passed in 21, when I was 21. But yeah, like an apathy for a long while, and then then I don't know. I just got really intrigued by the reality of death, and how do I put this? Like the scales of apathy, like where you just go along with life, and how the years pass by and you don't realize it, and like suddenly it hits you with what the, like, this is actually, like, you start to it's like an existential anxiety you start to come over you with this is an actual thing, even though I know the science, even though I know the,
Yeah.
this is nothing but supernova, periodic table elements, stardust stuff, like. But then you start to take seriously the fact that this is not just theoretical data points that you've learned in education. This is like an actual thing that's happened for the last, so many billions of years,
Mm.
and there is a sense of you can freak out if you think too hard about it. But then I calmed down and I wanted to see if basically the John Stott moment,
Yeah.
like Jesus of the scars moment, like if God, if there is a deity that shares in our scars, but not that he becomes it, but rather in that beautiful notion of hypostasis, not mixing, but not separate,
Mm.
but yet at the same time like a bridging. If that happened, so that then, like, say what Hebrews gets at, that it's a shadow of a greater reality, which then C.S. Lewis, how he ends the Narnia book,
Yeah.
this is just the title page in the front cover. Now they're entering the great story, which is where every chapter is greater than the, like, if that's the truth of the matter, then how wonderful is that? And that's basically a point as well with, you know a 13 billion year old universe is like a blip in
Yeah.
this big
And
cosmic
worthwhile.
history of God. Yeah,
It's not a
yeah,
waste of time. I mean, it is wonderful to look back at that. I
yeah,
love fossils. Yeah, they're great. But the future is even better,
yeah,
and
yeah.
because it's a different kind of creation, it's a better. N.T. Wright's comparison of the psychikos with the what did you say, with the pneumatikos, the physically empowered with the spiritually empowered. So that sort of provides the continuity. Jesus's resurrection body was his resurrection body. He ate fish, he made a fire, and yet there was something absolutely other about it. He
Mm-hmm,
wasn't even recognized straight away by his
mm-hmm,
disciples. On every occasion they met him, he had to
mm-hmm.
kind of be recognized again, and that's the future, which is good.
Yeah. That's again Revelation 21. God's
Yeah,
tent is now among humans. Like it's yeah. And then wrong thinking. So you need. This is another thing I was wondering about. Like you need, say, 2,000 years since of further unraveling of this grand mystery, which Paul loves using that term. This great secret of this mystery of now what, like in Ephesians 5:8 he says about the church and Jesus and that marriage. Um, to then rule out wrong thinking about it, like the Gnostics who then divorce the
mm,
physicalness of the resurrection, and then the Arians who then try and divorce the spiritualness of the resurrection. In other words, Jesus is just a creature, not God in
yeah,
flesh. And
yeah,
so like you have all these like wrong ideas that prop up, and then the church now is sort of like a canceling out of every potential wrong idea that comes on the scene, and then what are you left with? Again, that orthodox creedal statement. So um, yeah, I'll take a few more questions. This is a more personal question for you. What's the beautiful set of strings behind John that you can't play? Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's a few more over there. That's an Epiphone Broadway, which I got because somebody asked me to play some jazz guitar, and there's the one just out of view, which I can lift up,
Oh, yep.
was made for me by a friend, great Christian luthier called Alvin Davis, who made me a couple of guitars, and that's a lookalike Rickenbacker 12-string. I play in church. Well, I was a folkie to begin with, then I became a rocker, and then I got old and forgot how to play anything. But we kind of do our best.
Mm.
I play saxophone as well. That's the other.
The only instrument I play is clarinet.
Oh, I struggle with
Yeah.
that. I rebuilt my dad's clarinet. He was a sax player, and
Right.
when he was getting old, he gave me a couple of saxophones and said, "Oh, the clarinet is not worth bothering about; it's so far gone." And then after he died, I thought, "Well, let's have a go at it." Rebuilt it, and it worked quite well, but I couldn't play it.
Mm. Any thoughts or comments on the passage from 2 Peter about fervent heat, which will destroy the world on the day of the Lord? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is no. I was thinking about that a couple of days ago when it was really hot, and then somebody was talking about nuclear war, and I said, "Now, does nuclear war count as a fire from God?" And I was thinking, no, maybe not. And obviously, it could be metaphorical, but I have no firm views about it, except that the world is going to be rolled up in this form and transformed.
Probably the most radical Concordist approach, again coming from Hugh Ross, but it's a tongue-in-cheek thing. Like it's neither here nor there. It's a flip a coin thing for me. But I think Peter is polemically using Greco-Roman concepts of cosmos.
Yeah.
But is it a coincidence that there is a legitimate Big Bang model called a ekpyrotic Big Bang model, where if the universe is 10 dimensions, as far as we know, 11 dimensions is string theory moving forward, but if you just take 10 dimensions and we put it on a flat sheet and then curl it onto itself, which can be done into like 11th dimensional plane, like a U shape, there's a quantum fluctuation that can suddenly where there's the two sheets sort of like cross and then it implodes. Now, is Peter thinking that? No, but there is a potential for the universe to curl up into itself if allowed from an external agency that folds it. So, in other words,
if it's a new creation, then we don't have to have that explanation. So it's and of course the one reason to think about a sort of some kind of literal thing is that Peter also he compares it with the flood that nobody thought was coming.
Yes.
And that in whatever form was a real flood, genuine water. So perhaps it'll be genuine heat.
And actually, it's one of the reasons why I believe it's a local flood, because if it's a global, universal flood, it should have happened everywhere. But it doesn't. He juxtaposes flood with Sodom and Gomorrah as being local disasters, as types or images of this grand, big universal thing.
We are entitled to bring science in there, I think, and the more or less impossibility of a worldwide flood for all kinds of physical reasons.
It doesn't seem like there's any more relevant questions. So well, what I'll do is I'll put the link in to the stream. So if anyone wants to join, I'll probably end the stream maybe in 20 minutes.
Okay.
Sort of just round it off to 2 hours. So if anyone wants to come on to the stream to ask Jon a question personally, feel free to jump on. Otherwise, that's basically it. It's been I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. It's very rare to have these type of discussions. I'll be honest with you. It's usually just me like when I do Q&As and I share the scholarship and my own musings, and then when I see when I read your book, I'm thinking, wait a second, this is something I would have written. So
if you'd have written it, you could have saved me the trouble.
Hey, it's Josh. Hey man, long time no see you here.
Nice icon.
G'day, can you see me?
Hey man, it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while indeed. Um, Obviously been
How are you
down in
doing?
the land.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had a
Mm.
question for John there.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Have you looked into like uh the whole bodies of God within the Old Testament and etc.?
The bodies of God.
Yes.
Um, right. Obviously, when you read the Old Testament, you have to think about these things. I don't think God has a body. No man has seen God at any time, but God manifests Himself, doesn't He, in various ways to man. Um,
Because my
the
question is, do you find it interesting that there's like this big concept within the ancient Near East that um you've got these other deities, these other gods having bodies and not. Then you've got this revolutionary idea that God does have a body, but at the same time, there's no image of Yahweh. It's very and you get this evolutionary type development over a grand portion of time. I would say that's doesn't isolate from the Trinity. Actually, kind of uplifts it.
Yeah, I think the question is, well, yeah, you've got a couple of questions. The first is whether when God appears to man in obviously human form, what's going on there. Is it a theophany? Is it what? And then you've got the kind of problem that trying to think of the religious movement. Um, the guys who actually say that when it says, my heart, God's heart, then He has a heart, and when it says it uses poetic things about God, it's being literal. I don't think we need to go there. It's more, did the Hebrews
Oh, definitely.
consider
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
did the Hebrews consider that God had a body? I'm not sure they did, but they have a very coy way of thinking about God. I'm thinking of the visitors to Abraham before the destruction of Sodom. There's this kind of confusion apparently between the angel of God and God Himself, which they don't try to explain ever. It's just one of those things that's held as a kind of sacred mystery, I think, because the body of God that we see is that in Jesus, and there's a sense in which Jesus, I think, is we are made in His image, and clearly that's largely a spiritual comparison. But I think it's more than that. There's a sense in which Jesus always was resonating with the human form. I think even before His incarnation. But I can't say I've gone into it in great depth. So I might not be helping you very much.
Mm. Just just to sort of bridge what Josh is getting at. So I'm in the midst of writing a review, a critical response to a book that's just come out called God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou, uh, arguing that you have an evolution, not only an evolution of polytheism to monotheism. So in other words, pre-exilic Israelite religion had an actual idol statue of Yahweh with all the physical male features, that then gets reformed under Josiah into like casting away the images, even down to the whole like Asherah, the Asherah goddess of El. So apparently Yahweh had a consort, also Asherah, um, and um, and I kid you not, in her text she goes into very graphic sexual detail where she says, "I'm not kidding. This is in her," and she's considered like I mean, she is a professor in the University of Oxford, and she argues that Isaiah 6:1, based on one scholar, only one scholar, who wrote in the 90s, and it was just a paper, that the Hebrew, it's a rare Hebrew term, but it appears in Isaiah 6:1. So in Isaiah 6:1, when Isaiah says, "I saw the Lord seated on his lofty throne with the seraphim surrounding him," it says, like the King James has, like the train of his robes was filling the temple. And ancient Near Eastern scholars, in fact, Walton himself argues that that term can be paraphrased to mean something like say his council members act as like this cloud that's filling the temple, or kind of like his robe is the council members that are clothing him like that, right? But she argues that that term only occurs elsewhere in the Old Testament as applied to women's clothing, specifically covering the private parts. Ergo, sorry?
Ergo is Isaiah's talking about Asherah, is it?
No, ergo, Isaiah is having a vision of God's junk filling the temple. I'm not kidding. This is actually in this is supposedly serious discussions happening in the higher ivory tower of biblical scholarship. So much so that even
That's
I can't believe I'm
ridiculous.
doing this. I'll just bring this up just so John can see this. Even in a recently published Isaiah commentary, in a series that is considered to be like prestigious, but thankfully he refutes it though. So it's in this commentary. It's a 2018 publication. A critical exegetical commentary on Isaiah by H.E.M. Williamson. This is for the what's called the what's the series called again? I seem to be drawing a blank these days. But anyway, it is in critical scholarship. It's considered one of the top commentaries series of all Bible commentaries. So, like as you can see over here under Isaiah 6:1, he's having to refute this concept of God's penis that supposedly Isaiah is describing. Based on this guy named Esslinger, who argues that this Hebrew term is talking about. In other words, Isaiah is saying, "And I saw God's penis filling the temple." That's I kid you not. That's the type of argumentation that you're going to be seeing in regards to the bodied God. So that's where Josh is getting at. It's like, what's
it goes with the failure somehow to follow the biblical idea that there was apostasy and syncretism in early Judaism, wasn't there? I mean, the whole problem of the prophets was that these guys kept on making images. They adopted the Baal pantheon, which overlapped. I mean, it was, if you think of the Table of Nations, what is amazing is how much of the Hebrew type worldview was spread across the ancient Near East, so that Abraham can meet with Melchizedek, worshipping the same God, so that and all those sort of things. But it's not too surprising if you find images of Yahweh and Asherah, because there was so much syncretism that the prophets were always having to fight. But they take that as being the mainstream religion, as if Gnosticism was.
It's just arguments from silence. That's all it is.
My concept.
Okay.
Sorry, Rob.
Yeah.
Sorry. My concept would be, if that were to be the case, that you're trying to argue that Yahweh's glory is somehow being associated with other deities surrounding the ancient Near East that are also, because there are other ancient Near Eastern deities that are associated to being naked, being sexualized in some type of worship or whatnot. But I would have an issue trying to do that with what the biblical text is doing, because even in regards to the Levitical outline and how the priests are covered up,
absolutely.
how they are going into the temple, they're covered up. They've got special purity laws in how to approach this being that's very sometimes can appear like you get, obviously the theophany appearances are very very holy. So I don't see how the train of his glory would be associated with that, especially if you've got in the Isaiah timeline, you've got a very strong monotheistic sense, sort of not to align Yahweh with these other. Anyways, I'm just ranting on. Yeah.
No, it's a rant away. It's the problems with modern scholarship, I think. Which
Michael Heiser's said something very interesting, that before any scholar does any good academic work, they should undergo a form of logic.
A logic class. Yeah. Take a class of logics. Yeah. Like right. Yeah. Sorry, John, go for it. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, not having come through that school, except from the outside, knowing theologians and what they'd been, evangelical theologians and others, and what they've been subjected to in their training, and had to resist. That inured me to those ideas, I think.
Yeah, I'll conclude. So I'll conclude this particular topic on something like this. This is in another critical scholarly work called Only One God, Monotheism in Ancient Israel and the Veneration of the Goddess Asherah. So this is the type of, again, argumentation that they make, saying that, in Deuteronomy 33, when the King James has something like, and a fiery law came out of his right hand. Well, fiery law happens to be that just at one time occurrence of the Hebrew term, Asherah Da, it actually can be, it could be a deliberate misspelling of Asherah, like just a one-letter difference between the two words. So so they're like, look, accepting a minor correction to the text is possibly the only passage in which Asherah is mentioned as Yahweh's spouse, like, because he had his right hand his own Asherah. But you know what's interesting is that then Walton and Heiser, in writing, argue that the whole notion of Asherah as being a sacred tree pole thing, well, whenever God appears to people like Abraham, like by an oak or by a tree, it's interesting that that term is also applied to Lady Wisdom, which ultimately, is it then a potential polemic to say, yeah, you have, say, the consort of El versus Yahweh and his wisdom, which then leads to Trinitarian thinking, because the wisdom is the Logos. So there's that. So if you have an El Asher pairing, now you have Yahweh wisdom pairing, the two and yet one. You see that, so now it comes full circle. It's like, okay, now we're back to orthodox thinking again. Like, where's your so-called evolution? There is no evolution.
The first book of John Walton's that I got, which was long before the Lost World of series, was I think probably the first one he wrote, which was about the comparative texts between the Old Testament and ancient Near East of one sort or another. And the thing that came out so much was just the huge contrast just in the whole character of the biblical text compared to everything around it. The closer you look, the more different they are, which goes for the creation story, for example.
Coming back to your work on that.
But the attempt to kind of, as you say, to get an evolutionary view in complete disregard of the facts. You amend the text to. It sounds like Darwinian evolutionary theory, really. If the evidence doesn't fit all to the evidence. Sorry, that was a
no, that's a relevant point. Yeah. I'll conclude the stream with this, John. I've spoken to Josh about this actually prior. Like Josh and I used to do a lot of like Bible studies together, and in John 1:1 in the Chinese Bible, this is again the beauty of the gospel and like Jesus's very audacious statement: "Go into all the world and preach this message and make disciples." It's like, hang on, Jesus, we're a Semitic culture. How on earth is this message going to be relevant to people everywhere? And let's see what happens, right? So the concept of the Tao, this immaterial, you can't even define it. It's like a deistic thing, and yet the closest word to the term logos is the word Tao, and in the Chinese Bible, it's in the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao became flesh. It's like, what? It's like upgrading the cultures. Like, it's using this. It's not divorcing the culture from the concept, but rather it's, let's go along with your concept and introduce a final, more complete picture of what you may have as an incomplete picture, but now it's complete. And Jesus
you have to do that culturally, because there is, as you say, it's the only word, much as the generic word for God in Arabic is Allah. So Arabic Christians are going to be talking, they won't say, is Allah the same God as the Christian God, because they're both Allah. But the danger is, of course, that you then import the alien parts of, you get I don't know, a Stoic version of the Logos rather than John's version. You start kind of translating into the culture rather than translating the culture into the Bible. But interesting. Next time I read my Chinese Bible.
Or if you have any Chinese friends, be like, hey, is it a Tao mentioned there? Like, and then it'll spark a discussion.
It's interesting as well, because there's a certain I've looked into quite a bit, a particular I'll be quick, Rob, because I know you probably want to hurry the stream up. But there's a Muslim mystic motif scholar that goes by the name of Ibn Arabi, and he goes down the train of thought that God is beyond human and consciousness ways. Then he entertains that thought process, and then he can't help but in fact go down the route of Trinitarian thinking, and that's where it ends. It doesn't end bad, like he tries to create an apologetical argument against it. It's more that he actually agreed with it, that Allah is. Now, I'm not saying this is because this is true. This means that the Quran is actually endorsing this. I'm just saying it's interesting that you've got a particular Muslim that goes into the mystic belief, then still holds to his Islamic theology, but at the same time entertains the thought. Basically, he's meditating on it. It's that wajud, wajad, the God is being, bliss, and conscious, but the fact that he's being in bliss, like you've got this, David Bentley Hart talks about it in great detail. The fact that God is, you can't say he's solely one, and somehow try to know that God's transcendence. Because in the I would say in the Islamic belief that they say no, God is one. He's not Trinitarian. It's basically they're assuming some form of his transcendence, which is can't do that. Unless you're Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, it's rather like those rabbis who kind of say things like, well, having looked at it, when the Messiah comes, he's going to be someone very like Jesus, and yet they
oh well, yeah.
don't take that step of
It's like,
recognizing.
hello.
Hello, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
John,
you.
any particular works? Like, is there going to be like a part 3 in your, like, make it like a
No,
trilogy
we
of
did.
books, or?
Josh regarded his book and my two as a trilogy, which was very flattering.
Oh,
More
and that's why
people.
you made that graphic, like with Josh's
Well,
book in the middle.
and, oh, well, don't know if his book goes in the middle, but no, it was my publisher was different from his, which is why the covers have nothing to do with each other. But
Yeah.
uh, no, I did. COVID came. I did a short book on a theology of nature, which is up on as a DOI somewhere on the web. But no, it was a short layman's guide to non-materialism, basically. And I'm taking a new look at how to do science theistically. So it would never sell because it makes such a break with the last 500 years of scientific
Right.
assumptions, metaphysics. But that's that's what I did. The other thing I did was the year before COVID came, I got into something I'd done a little bit on the blog, propaganda and deception, the way that the world was becoming full of deception. So that when COVID came, although it was kind of, I sort of said, hey, this has come several years earlier than I thought it would. Just the way that the world has descended into chaos. So that's online on my blog. That's a freebie. And it was already out. I finished it in 2019, and then COVID and everything else has happened since. So, but it's got some useful stuff on propaganda and the human propensity for believing it. But no follow up to these books yet. Perhaps
Okay.
I'll get a prompting from God or someone else to do something.
Right. So do you feel like, so any particular projects at the moment, or do you feel
no? I mean,
these books are
kind of
sufficient
between.
with what, like, your musings that you've had for a while, and now you're
Not particularly. No, I mean, there again shifts of direction from time to time, and recently I've been looking to see, what might be worth thinking about, and I've certainly been thinking more about nature and origins and that kind of stuff again, having been thinking about the nasty human world for the past 4 years, which is really rather depressing. It's quite a relief to get back to God's bit of the world.
a normality, right? Yeah.
But whether anything will come of it, I kind of lack the contacts that I used to have in Biologos. Prompted a lot. You disagreed with nearly everyone there and made friends with some of the others, and that isn't happening at the moment. But we'll see what happens.
Okay.
I'm not that old yet.
And with that being said, yeah, thanks for coming on. And again, if you want to do like another part 2 Q&A or further discussion, feel free to contact me again on email, and I'll email you back a link to some of my own writings. Like, I've written for my local church commentaries for them starting in 2016, and I've written on 3 books: Daniel, Revelation, and Mark.
Right.
Mark was Mark was one of those. Because Mark is the first gospel, or the first biography of Jesus according to scholarship, and I wanted to see for myself verse by verse. Like, that's my approach in the commentary. I go verse by verse, but then I pull in the church father quotes, relevant scholarly quotes, and I want to see, just in my face, there's Jesus from start to finish, his life story according to Mark. and it's wonderful. It really solidified my faith completely in that sense. And you'll even see Josh, believe it or not, you'll see Josh Swamidass appear in that commentary, because by the time you reach Mark 10, when Jesus talks about Adam and
Right.
but that's, yeah. And Daniel was the latest one I just did. Revelation was the other one. People want me to do John, but I'm gonna take a break. I think my next project will be sort of like the big picture, like God and the universe, science sort of series I want to do. And your
Yeah.
book is definitely will be it's a blessing. Let's just put it that way.
Thank you. Thank you.
The way you've put your thoughts down is sort of like you've actually you've done a more efficient job at putting the data points down, because I know that I have an issue. I can't simplify things. I struggle to
Most of my readers say I can't.
yeah, but you have a gift of, like, just in one paragraph, like it's jam packed with so many things you can unravel,
Yeah.
out of just this one paragraph. But you've put it that way, like that's
My
your
writing
approach.
starts off in journalism. I should put in a plug for the blog, of course, which has still been going since
Yes, I
2000.
linked your blog, by the way. Like, it's
Thank
in
you.
people
There's
will
about
access it.
some
Yeah.
2.5 million words on there now. Some of them might be worth reading, but
Is that the
no, I
blog
started
with Saigot as well, like the
Hump of the
hump of
Comet.
the
Well,
camel?
yeah, officially, essentially everyone else has dropped away. So
Okay.
Sai, we had had a number of 4 or 5 of us. I started it, and then a couple of years later, we kind of absconded from Biologos and started a kind of new way of looking at things. I've carried on, and it goes in very different directions. But it's journalistic, really. That's where I started. I started off in medical journalism, and then Christian journalism, and then 12 years of a blog. So it keeps me off the booze, you know.
Are you familiar with Joel Duff?
Yeah, I've come across him. Yeah.
Well, just before the stream ends, Joel, if you want to quickly jump on.
Oh, hello.
So he says, I'm way late here, but wanted to chime in and also say thanks to John for his work. Very helpful to me.
Thank you.
So yeah, Joel, come on in. Otherwise, I'll end the stream if you can't make it. But yeah, that'll be my next project. And that's really it. So
Well,
just waiting to see if Joel responds. Here we go. He says, as usual, we are at odds with time players. I'm traveling and won't be able to. Okay, that's all right. All right, Joel, then catch up with the stream. You'll love it. So, all right. Can you close us out in prayer, John, and then I'll end the stream. Yep, thank you.
Lord God, we think of those who are listening or have listened or watched this, and ask that you will bless them with your word and with your spirit. Thank you for your world. Thank you for your creation that speaks of you. Thank you for your word that teaches us about you and that shows us the way to Jesus. And pray for those who might have been watching with doubts or without knowing you, and ask that something that we've said might just trigger your living word in their hearts. Ask that you'll bless each one of us now, whether we're just waking up in the morning or going to bed or somewhere in between. And thank you for Rob and for the whole setup that he's got here. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
All right, folks. I'll see you again next time. God bless everyone.
Thanks for having me.